Video games exist in a world that is not our own. Sure, they physically exist on Earth, but that unreal landscape that we're transported to every time we boot up a game is a world that we can't touch, see, or feel with our own human senses. As players, we need to be given the tools that allow us to translate this game world into something that we can understand with our corporeal bodies. We need something to feel, something to see, and something to touch. As game designers, we have the deepest understanding of our game world. That means that our job is to craft the finest tools that we can for the players, that they might experience the game world as we intend. So today's topic is the 3 C's. Character, camera, controls. The 3 C's combine to form an analytical lens that we can use to analyze our game design and implementation, as well as the game design and implementation of other games. Through this framework, we can form stronger understanding of video game worlds, extract wisdom from the many incredible games that are already out there, and feed this wisdom right back into the games that we're making. Applying a framework like the 3 C's forces us to think about the player experience beyond the initial implementation, and it allows us to form a more robust metric that we can use when we're playtesting our games. And sure, there's no unifying theory of everything in game design. The way that we look at something like Tetris or Minesweeper is obviously going to be very different from the way we would look at something like Devil May Cry. The 3 C's as a framework is pretty self-explanatory, but it works best when the 3 C's are actually in the game, which means a character to focus on, a dynamic camera through which we can see the character, and a control system that allows us to interact with the other 2 elements. And sure, you could say that Tetris is viewed through a camera, and the tetrominoes are the characters which we control. And I guess you're not wrong. But we probably at least want to focus on a game where both the camera and the character are dynamic, likely to move, and do something exciting. In this video, I'm going to be using a lot of different games as examples to illustrate all of the various points. But to try and keep things grounded around the 3 C's, and how slight adjustments can result in huge differences in the game feel experience, I'm going to be focusing on 3 specific games. The original Dark Souls, Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance, and Kingdom Hearts 3. In case you've never heard of it, Dark Souls is a 2011 game released by Japanese developers From Software, or FromSoft. FromSoft have decades in game development at this point, and up until Dark Souls were mostly known in the West as the niche developers behind Kingsfield, Armored Core, and a few other titles over the years. (2011's Dark Souls, and to a slightly lesser extent 2009's Demon Souls, were huge hits in the West, with the games and all of their follow-ups becoming popular enough to define an entirely new genre, the Soulsborne. Dark Souls is a third-person, hardcore, medieval fantasy, action RPG, where your character, the Chosen Undead, must traverse the land of Lordran. You'll be killing other undead, monsters, dragons, and even gods as you go. In Dark Souls, you can run around the environment, change your equipment, attack, defend, dodge, and die. Over and over and over. Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance is a 2013 game released by Japanese developers Platinum Games and published by Konami. Platinum Games were formed in 2007 after the closure of Capcom's Clover studio, who were known for their critically acclaimed run of games Beautiful Joe, Okami, and God Hand. Platinum then continued this trend of building incredibly stylish, character-focused action games. They released hits like Bayonetta and third-person shooter Vanquish. Before eventually stepping in to help it with the troubled development of Metal Gear Solid Rising, as it was known at the time. They helped turn it into the Revengeance that we all know and love today. Revengeance was a departure from the stealth action gameplay of the original Metal Gear Solid games. It was classic Platinum. Over-the-top, character-focused 3D action. With tight mechanics, a great soundtrack, incredible boss fights, and memes.
The memes.
Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance is a third-person, hardcore, near-future action game, where your character, Raiden, must traverse the land of the United States of America, killing cyborg soldiers, robot dogs, giant robots, and United States senators as you go. In Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance, you can run around the environment, change your equipment, attack, defend, dodge, and die. Over and over and over. And finally, Kingdom Hearts 3. It's a 2019 game released by Japanese developers Square Enix. Square Enix were formed in 2003 after the merger of Japan's Square and Enix corporations, bringing together at last the House of Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest. Square Enix continued their trend of building sprawling, character-focused role-playing games, releasing hits like Final Fantasy XI and Final Fantasy XII. Just before the merger, in 2002, Squaresoft, as they were known at the time, branched out into the world of brand synergy with Kingdom Hearts. It was an action RPG, featuring characters from the Final Fantasy series and a whole host of Disney properties. The series continues to this day, with each entry upping the stakes, upping the narrative confusion, and exponentially increasing the powers of main character Sora. Kingdom Hearts 3 is a third-person, anime, fantasy action game where your character, Sora, must traverse the land of various Disney properties, killing nobody, but defeating heartless, nobodies, Disney villains, and an old man and his many clones as you go. In Kingdom Hearts, you can run around the environment, change your equipment, attack, defend, dodge, and die. Over and over and over. If you're playing on critical mode. Those are, admittedly, three very different games, but they all share a similar core. A focal third-person character, melee combat with an emphasis on calculated attack and defense, big boss battles, and a camera that can be free or locked onto a target. By slightly altering their approach to the 3 Cs, they end up with incredibly different results. Now, with all of that out of the way, Let's start by looking at the focal point of our adventures, the character. The character represents who we are in the game world. It's our avatar, our vehicle through which we can experience everything the game has to offer. The character has to translate, through the controls, everything that we want to do as players into the actions that the game will allow us to do. The character is an aesthetic skin draped across a skeleton of mechanics and a muscle of dynamics. They're often the primary source of player feedback, and their design provides a sense of player identity. We could spend a lot of time here talking about character aesthetics and design, how the audio and visual design of a character will tell us a lot about what the character can do. Today though, we are going to focus on gameplay. So I'll just briefly say that the corporeal form of a character should tell us something about them. In Team Fortress 2, it was really famously designed so that each character had a distinct role, and that they could be identified by silhouette alone from any distance, even when bullets and rockets were flying everywhere.
One shudders to imagine what inhuman thoughts lie behind that mask.
This creates a direct link between the character aesthetic and the gameplay. In fighting games, different character archetypes can usually be identified simply through their visual design. So if you're building a character for your game, even just your prototype, think about how you can convey information about the game mechanics through your character visual. The way it moves, how it's animated, the color, VFX, all of these things are just part of the puzzle. In Dark Souls, characters have weight. As you equip bigger weapons and heavier armor, you see this reflected in your character's move speed and animations. This tells you straight away that this is having an effect on your combat ability. Pretty much every action in Dark Souls commits you to that action. Rolling or attacking will lock you into an animation. Heavy armor will increase that animation's length. If you get hit, it's probably going to stagger your character. This dance of attack and defense for the player is all about identifying and abusing this commitment, but from the enemy perspective. It's all about risk and reward, and how well you can attack, defend, and punish. Dark Souls also provides many avenues for player expression. You have different skills, weapons, armors, spells. All of these things can massively change how you play the game. Someone who wields a dagger is going to be playing a totally different game to somebody who is using pyromancy, to somebody who is wielding two great swords. Kingdom Hearts, on the other hand, is a magical anime experience, where the physics are whatever they need to be at any given moment. You can jump super high, you can run up walls, you can glide, you can stay in the air to attack, fall from great heights, and suffer no ill effects. For the vast majority of the game, you play as Sora. Your player expression mostly comes from your equipment and the way that you play the game. A player might decide to focus on magic, on hitting people with a giant key, on changing into the various different forms, or some combination of the above. Combat in Kingdom Hearts 3 is much lower commitment than the Dark Souls games. Most attacks can be cancelled into a dodge roll or into a guard, and if you have a big finisher attack, you can still cancel it by spending a resource. This free-form style of combat tells you how to play it. Be on the offensive, but be ready to react at any time. Metal Gear Rising, we are going to come back to. Right now, though, we're going to look at an even more specific aspect of these games. We're going to look at how each of them addresses the topic of defense. In Dark Souls, defense is the name of the game. If you're wielding a shield, you can hold a button to block. This creates a really wide window for successfully stopping an attack. You might mitigate some or all of the incoming damage, and the resource you spend to mitigate that damage is your stamina. You can only block so many attacks before you run out of stamina, and if that happens, you get guard broken and you're left wide open. When you're holding your shield up, it pauses your stamina recovery. So this forces you to look for openings where you can drop your shield and recover some stamina, allowing you to block more attacks. This risk-reward creates openings where the enemy might hit you. All of the blocking in Dark Souls is directionally based. So this ties closely into the camera side of the game, where if you're not managing your camera and looking at where enemies might be attacking you from, you might be looking the wrong way when an enemy does attack, and you'll get hit in the back even if you did have your shield raised. This whole system is modified by various things within the game. The stats of your current shield might change how much damage you can block and what types of damage you're good at blocking. And your stats are going to modify what type of shields you're able to wield. And the one twister that adds an even greater risk and reward to this whole mix is the parry mechanic. In Dark Souls, if you're wielding any sort of regular shield, you can press the left trigger to try to parry an attack. This is a huge gamble on the player's behalf, saying that I know what attack this is going to be and I know when it's going to hit, and if I time this parry correctly, I'm going to negate all damage and the enemy is going to be left wide open for a riposte and loads of damage with a counterattack. So very skilled players can go through the game and instead of defensively blocking every attack, they can turn this defensive action into an offensive one and convert it into damage. All of this combines into the slow and methodical combat that Dark Souls is very well known for. The player has to always be aware of their positioning, and they have to be able to balance their resources, health, stamina, magic, if they want to attack, defend, and fight against the bosses. Blocking is pretty much always a safe option in Dark Souls, but relying on it too much is going to drain your stamina, which either leads to a lot of damage when you do get guard broken, or it means that you won't be able to attack because your attacks also drain your stamina. If you block a huge combo, and then when the enemy is wide open, you don't have any stamina left, you can't hit them back. This is where dodging comes in as well. Dodging is a more resource-efficient way to avoid attacks, but it's a little bit risky. If you time it wrong, you're going to get hit for the full damage. But if you're good at it, you can dodge through enemy attacks and be ready to strike them again at a moment's notice. In Kingdom Hearts 3, if you want to block, all you have to do is press the square button. This creates a small window in which you can successfully stop basically any attack in the game. If your block doesn't stop an attack though, it'll lock you into that animation and you can't block, dodge, or move for a short amount of time. So this exists to try and stop players from just mashing the block button in hopes that they'll get lucky. If a block does stop an attack though, you can start reacting immediately. You can go into a counterattack, you can dodge roll to move out of the way, you can keep blocking if more attacks are coming. Unlike Dark Souls, blocking in Kingdom Hearts is omnidirectional. It doesn't matter which way you're facing, as long as your timing is correct. This means that the player can focus more on what they're doing in the battle and where they are, rather than trying to see what every enemy is up to. This also means that the game can throw more enemies at you without feeling unfair. If you were constantly surrounded in Dark Souls, it would be a terrible time. But in Kingdom Hearts, as long as you can see when an enemy is about to attack, you can probably deal with it. Kingdom Hearts has no sort of chip damage, so even if somebody throws a meteor at you, you can block it successfully. There's no shields with different stats, and there's very few unblockable attacks, so generally blocking is an incredibly safe option in Kingdom Hearts. Blocking also ties directly into the counterattack system, and these counterattacks can create openings. Against some bosses, you have to play entirely defensively until you're able to exploit a gap in their offense, hit with a counterattack, and then take your turn to wail on them. All of this combines to create a very active style of combat. In Dark Souls, you're waiting for the right opportunity and striking back. For most of Kingdom Hearts, however, you are encouraged to be doing stuff just at all times. There are enough trash mobs that you need to be attacking, using your area of effect spells, and just clearing out a whole battlefield. Offense and defense happen sort of automatically for the most part, so you are rewarded for your battlefield awareness. Something really smart that Kingdom Hearts does when you go to the higher difficulty of critical mode, or when you do some of the super bosses and the DLC, is that it inverts this. All of a sudden you have to play much more defensively and wait for your time, just like in Dark Souls. Something really cool about these modes is that the developers of the game don't change the mechanics at all. You're still using the existing toolset, but they just expect you to use them in a different way. This means that the combat designers can build really cool situations where the player feels really, really good because they've managed to work themselves out of incredibly difficult situations and look incredible as they do it. Finally, let's come back to Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance. The reason why I said we would come back to it later is that there is no block button. Instead, Metal Gear Rising has a parry mechanic, which you activate by attacking towards an enemy as they attack you. If you do this with perfect timing, you'll perform a counterattack. This creates a reasonably high skill floor, but an incredibly high skill ceiling. So what the developers are trying to tell you here is that you have to keep attacking to survive. Always be hitting the attack button. There's really only one truly defensive option in the game, which is a dodge, but you have to buy that, you don't get it at the start, and that's kind of introduced as an extra mechanic. So if you want to block in this game, you have to attack towards the opponent that is attacking you. There's a small window to successfully stop the attack, and a very small window to counter that attack. You can chain blocks together as long as you want, so this means you can kind of keep mashing towards an attack and keep blocking. This allows the player to go between attacks and blocking relatively safely if they know what they're doing. Like Dark Souls, Revengeance has directional blocking, but it takes it one step further in that you have to instigate towards the enemy. You can't just be facing them at the time. So not only do you need camera awareness of where the enemies are, but you also need directional awareness and timing awareness of the enemy's attacks. If you're not moving towards the enemy as you try to parry it, you'll just perform a regular attack, you won't parry, and you'll get hit instead. Any attack in the game that is unblockable is clearly signposted. The enemies will glow yellow as they attack, and this means that you have to do something else, like run away, jump, or use the dodge move we mentioned before. If there are enemies with ranged attacks, you can either block them by chopping the missiles to pieces, or if they're shooting you with regular bullets, performing a ninja run will automatically block these. What the game designers are trying to tell you here is that if you're not attacking, then you should be moving, and you should be moving fast. Finally, the tight timing on the parry mechanic asks the player to break their own internal combat rhythm to try to react to the enemy you might not be seeing. If you're in the middle of a crazy combo and you suddenly see an attack coming in, you have to be ready to react to that right now. So you really have to change what your brain is doing to go from attack to defense immediately. And then think about how are you going to react after that parry. Whether you get a normal parry and just block it, or a special counterattack parry and turn it over into offensive time. Let's look at another game, and this time focus on something much more recent. We're going to look at the independently developed 3D Metroidvania platformer called Pseudo Regalia. If you haven't heard of it, Pseudo Regalia is an excellent study in simple and effective mechanic design. The individual pieces of the game are relatively simple, but they combine to make a really satisfying whole. And each part of it has had great thought put into how the mechanics should feel for the player. As a game development study, one of the really amazing things about Pseudo Regalia is that you can see the bones of how it's made. And this really helps us to be able to pick it apart and try and work out what we could steal for our own games. Let's just focus on the character for now. The game's design is obviously meant to evoke the 3D platformers of the 90s from PlayStation and the Nintendo 64. But on top of this, it adds a layer of modern game design sensibilities and little pieces of game feel that make the whole package play much better than any of those games did at the time. You don't start the game with very much, only a jump. But even this simple jump has so much great mechanic design behind it that it feels so satisfying. And this is a really important part when trying to build your character in a prototype or in a game. The character that you make should be satisfying to run around in a room even when there's nothing else to do. And if you pick up Pseudo-Regalia and give it a try, just jumping around on top of some cages in that first room is really satisfying. So let's try and pick that apart. It's a feature that is taken for granted in most platformers these days, but it's something that you'll notice in a project as soon as you realize it's not there. And that's that all of the jumps in Pseudo-Regalia, the height of them is based on how long you hold the button. It's not very complex design, and it's not very difficult to implement. But it takes a lot of playtesting until you get it feeling just right. The jump also employs other classic platformer techniques, such as Coyote Time. Coyote Time is a piece of game design named after Wile E. Coyote of Looney Tunes fame. It means that once you walk off an edge, rather than flagging the character as immediately being airborne and disallowing any further jumps, the game provides a brief window for the player to still be able to jump as if they were on the ground. This means that a player can get the max distance when jumping across a gap without accidentally just walking right off the edge. It's a little affordance that makes the game feel much easier to play, and most players won't notice it. On the other side of the spectrum, the game also employs jump buffering. Jump buffering is a technique where, when the user supplies a jump input by pressing the jump button, if they do this in a situation where normally they wouldn't be allowed to jump, but they are just about to be in a situation where we would let them jump, we hold on to that, and as soon as they get into that situation, we perform the jump for them. So if the character is falling and just about to hit the ground, and what the user wants to do is jump as soon as they land, maybe they want to bunny hop, when they press that button, we store it for a little window, and if they get into a situation where they can jump within that time, we jump for them. Part of what we want the character to do is interpret what the user wants to do and perform that. We don't just want to limit to what the user actually says to do. This leads to frustration when the player feels like the controls don't work as they expect. Another nice little touch is that you can see here that when the character in Pseudo-Regalia jumps, they stretch a little bit. This is a really common technique that just adds a little bit of feedback to the jump process. It makes them look a little less static when they're jumping and launching through the air. And all of that just covers the basic jump mechanic. We've not even talked about the other abilities that you pick up as you go through the game. One of the first abilities you get is a slide, which lets you go under objects and move a little bit faster. From here, if you really want to, you can bunny hop and start going really fast. Early in the game, you'll find a wall kick ability, which will allow you to get to greater heights and cross wider gaps by kicking off of the walls. Pretty soon you get the slide jump. So now you can perform a slide jump out of that and conserve your momentum, and kick off a wall to go even further and higher. So now that all of the puzzles and the design in the game are able to take these things into account and build really interesting mechanical puzzles for the players to solve just through the tools that they've been practicing so far. Rather than building loads of distinct mechanics, it's loads of little interconnected things that all make sense as you pick them up, because they are expanding what you already know. A little bit later, you get an air slam. This means that if you're going quite fast and you need to land on a platform, you can perform the air slam and you'll land accurately. After the air slam, you can perform a high jump. The high jump obviously lets you go much higher, and you can combine this with your wall kicks and other mechanics to even get to places where you're maybe not supposed to be yet. But the game never punishes you for it. It's always designed so that if you get to somewhere where you're maybe not meant to be yet, you just keep going and you kind of skip parts of the game. So you can see here that lots of little simple mechanics combine into a really deep suite of tools that we give the player in order for them to be able to express themselves in the game world. And the real amazing thing that Pseudo Regalia does is each single part feels great. It doesn't wait until you get the whole suite of tools before you feel like you're enjoying the game. The game feels great the whole way through. Also, that getting these abilities, and you can get them in different orders, doesn't entirely break the game world. This is not an advertisement for Pseudo Regalia. I'm not being paid by the developers. However, it is only £5 on Steam, and it is a masterclass in 3D platformer design. So, if you have any interest in the genre, I think you really owe it to yourself to pick it up and run through it. It's only about 3 to 5 hours long, depending on how lost you get. I believe the developer said that there is a map update coming soon, so maybe you want to wait for that. So, let's sum up. What have we learned about characters, and how can we apply this to our prototype? First, that we need to try and think about what the player experience is that we're trying to evoke. Your prototype is probably not going to have a really detailed animated character, so we need to think about how we can reinforce this feeling through the use of simple prototype assets. Thomas Was Alone is a really good example of doing a lot with very little. Each character is a simple rectangle, but the game does a lot to give each one of them a unique character, both in personality and through their gameplay mechanics. With Pseudo Regalia, we've seen that simple mechanics can be combined to create really complex character-focused gameplay, and that by providing feedback to the player, we make those mechanics feel much better in the player's hands. In our study of Dark Souls, Metal Gear Rising, and Kingdom Hearts, we've seen that the high-level design of our game is just that. It's high-level. It's when we start to define the nuance and intricacies of our design, taking into account available options, resources, the intended pacing, and how we want the player to feel. That's how we're going to define and create a unique gameplay experience. The challenge here is, how do we communicate these options to the player? This is why the game feel and feedback to the player is so important from the character. The character should tell the player what they're doing wrong, and it should feel rewarding when they're playing as intended, or if they're able to subvert the system somehow. So now it's time to take all of this and think about your own prototype, if it's going to have a character that you have some sort of control over. If that's the case, you're going to need to think beyond the high-level design pretty soon. What sort of feedback are you going to give the player throughout the gameplay about the mechanic? How is the game going to reinforce correct decisions? And what information are you going to provide if they make a mistake? How is your character going to move? How high are they able to jump? When can they jump? All of these little decisions are the difference between a capsule collider with basic movement and something incredibly satisfying like the character controller in Pseudo Regalia. So I hope this has been informative, and I hope you found some things that you can apply to your own prototype development. And next time, we are going to be looking at the second and the third of the 3 C's, camera and controls. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.
And it ends
ends here.
Okay. Let's dance!